Hi all, and welcome to another Lunch and Learn. Today what we're going to be covering is variables and expression with a focus in the app designer itself. So what is it? So variables are essentially placeholders. They are either used to maintain static values, but you can update them through the course of interacting with the actual app itself. You can use variables in the expression editor. You can use other variables with them, calculated fields, etc. And an expression, you could think of that as an extra column on a data source. It allows you to calculate the different additional fields, different values that you can actually use when binding that data source to the actual form itself. So we're going to cover two main areas of variable use in the app designer. There are three. We're just going to focus on the two that are within the app designer. The third one is actually in the data stream designer. We'll cover that in another lunch and learn when we tackle some of the items in the data stream designer. So for today, we're just going to focus on the two areas of variable use in the app designer itself. We're going to tackle variables within an app. So where are they? How do we get to them? How do we view them? Etc. And some basic requirements. You obviously need access to the app designer to tackle the one. The second area, it is an administrative area. Typically, it's something you'll set up and configure once, so you might not have it depending on your access into the actual site itself. Skill level for this, there are some beginner pieces in here, but we're starting to move into more of the intermediate skill levels as we start configuring these as well. There are two external links as well. I've got them on the right, and I'll walk through what those are as we get into this. So as I mentioned, the first thing is inside the app designer, there's two areas of where variables are used and you can interact with them. The first is obviously you need administrative access or the ability to manage, create, update the variables. On the left, if you click the hamburger, you can expand the menu and see all the different options. You'll see a variables I've got at the bottom here. If you do not have this option, it means you do not have the rights to maintain or change the variables as we go into it. If you click the variables, it'll actually open up a different blade which is listing all the variables that is currently available for the apps. Now, this is where you can set up your access to the different systems. It's also the area where you can come and actually make specific changes to the variables themselves. So let's say you have a specific service account that you're using to access System X, and you update that service account. Instead of having to go through all the apps and try and find all the apps that users have created, either you know all of them or you might even not know all of them. You can change it in one place instead of having to go through all of them individually. What the icons mean is I have not actually configured anything for these variables at the top. So there's a few options in here. You can manage categories, so you can actually create specific categories. All that does is allows you to easily group them in this particular view, so you can find what you're actually looking for as you go through them. When you create variables, there's a few options here. Main one is around the encrypt value. So you give it a name, you provide it a category, and the encrypt value is very important. As you'll see, when I create a connection to a particular data source and I want to use the variables, only encrypted variables will be available in password fields typically. So if you find something is not showing up in the field where you think it is, just make sure it's got the correct encryption type for that as well. So this is typically done from an IT perspective, typically done once, and you don't really need to come in here and edit it and make any changes in it. However, where do we actually use these? If I go into a particular app, and I'm just going to go into an existing app that I have here. When you go into the app data and you actually click the plus to add a new data source to your app itself, it's going to ask you some questions. So this is for a SQL connector. As I click that, it'll open up the properties for me over here. If I open up the next one, it'll open up, we'll use this one, it's a little smaller, we can see everything. Now, the first thing you'll notice is it has a use variables option here. This example, we're not making use of the variable option. The downside to doing this, as I've got it in here, means I need to make a change to every single app if my service account details actually change, or the passwords change, or the usernames change. It's much better to make sure you click the use variables, and we can now go in and we can see all the different options that are available. The ones which are not password fields will appear in the unencrypted, so typically your username, your instances, your client ID, etc. If we go into the password field, your list you'll see is a lot shorter. It will only show encrypted fields. So in this field here, it'll only show me and allow me to select the actual password field. In the username, it'll allow me to select all the different usernames that we have. And now I can very easily make sure I select the correct database and actually go from there. So the first area with regards to variables is an area that is, how do I access my data? So how do I get the data in? Who controls that? Where do you set that up? Typically you do that once, and you'll go back to it over time to make some changes and adjustments to it, and then you use that on the actual app itself. So if I go into a particular page as an example, and we want to add a new data source, it's going to ask me the same question. If I click the plus, it's going to ask me, well, where's my connection? If I do not have a connection and I click plus there again, it's going to walk me through adding that connection to the actual app itself, and I would suggest use the variables in that option as well. So that's the one main area to use variables. The second area where you can use variables is, as I've got this particular screen open, you'll see under page data, we have a few different sections. So up to now, we pretty much just focused on the design sources section, or the data sources section rather, where we can add different data sources. Parameters allows me to define some page parameters if I want to move values between different pages, and very useful if you've got drill downs, etc. The variables here, this allows me to create a variable for use in this app page. Now, important to note, your variables are specific to the app page. You can't share variables between pages. If you want to do that, you need to make use of the parameters and actually pass the variable down to be able to use it on any drill down pages that you want to use. So variables here are very much linked to the page that we've actually got in here. So when you create a new variable, you have a few options for it. Now, before I go into those options, I did mention there were two links on the slide that I had open. The first link will actually walk you into using the variables, adding the variables, and managing the variables here. If you go to our documentation site, so documentation.xmpro.com, top right there's a search. In the search, if you just search for variables, it'll bring up all the different items on variables. The how-to guide at the top is the one that we have open now. This is how can I define a variable that I want to use across all my apps. So typically your IT will set those up for you, and then you just use them as you run through the apps. The second area, if we actually scroll down the search results, you'll see variables and expressions. So the second link is actually variables and expressions that we've opened up over here. And this will walk you through how do we add a new, how do we edit, how do we configure them, etc. But the one point I want to make here is there's two modes that you can actually create a variable in. The one mode is what we would say is a value mode, which means you can keep updating a variable as you work through the page. The other mode is an expression, where you can actually write an expression which will hold the value of that variable. Now, what do I actually mean by that? You'll see I've got two variables here. If I click the edit and go on to the first variable, you'll see here it is defined as a value. Now what that means is this variable will store in the name selected time anything that I actually select. So it is a placeholder for me to use on this particular app. Now I can provide it a value through any of the other fields here that have a value option. And I'll show you where we're actually using it on this page. The second variable, if I click its pencil, this one actually opens up an expression. And how we change that is you click the value, you go to expression, it'll give you the expression. Now what's important here, when you are creating variables, make sure your data types are correct. Any of the parameters, operations, functions that you're trying to do here are specific to the data type. It's not going to allow you to save this if you're trying to convert text into a datetime or an integer and it's not compatible. So always make sure your datetime is correct. This particular expression here is adding days to the exact same variable that we've selected at the top. We are then getting the date difference and we are using a local time. So how did we actually create this? All expressions in the app designer follow a very similar approach. You have access to your parameters if you have any defined. If you click variables, you can actually see the variables will be listed here. How you add them to the expression editor, if I just push enter a few times to give a few new lines, if you double click the time, it'll actually fill in the values in the expression editor for you automatically. Again, you just double click time and it'll fill that in for you. You don't have to figure out how do I type it out, what's the correct spelling I need to use, etc. Just double click anything in the editor at the bottom and it'll add it to the top for you as well. Constants, when we are talking about true, false, is mobile, how do we define constants and use them as well? Functions, anything that you want to do from a datetime, logical, maths, business role, etc. will be in constant functions, and then you have operators coming down the bottom and here as well. So the datetime, you have a lot of options in here. If we go all the way down to the add days, if I click on that, so single click, not a double click. If I double click, it'll add it into the editor at the top. If I single click it, it'll actually bring up the help text for me on the right. So it'll give me an explanation of what it's expecting, and it'll also give me a description of what it is trying to do. So if I go into the logical and I click the if as an example, you'll see there, it'll give you just a breakdown of what it's expecting and then a brief description of what it's looking for. If I double click the if, it'll fill that in for me. I can now click into a particular area and I can go into the variables and I can actually use a variable in there as well. So we're just going to discard those changes for now and we'll come back to that. So selected time, again, this is just defined as a value, which means we're going to keep updating its value for it. So what do I mean by that? If I just open up another tab here and I just go into this actual app itself so we can see what it is displaying. So as the app loads, you'll see I have data, live data coming through. I have live data coming through, but I have a drop down at the top here. And I have certain fields in this drop down as well. If I select anything in the drop down, what you'll notice is I am now not getting my live data anymore, but I've got a specific snapshot in time that I'm viewing because I've selected at the top. If I go and delete that and tab out of that, you'll see it'll bring back my live view as well. This was done using a combination of variables and expressions. So let's break this down. If I come back into this particular app itself, the first thing is we've got the selected time defined. The second thing is on our date selector at the top. If we go to its properties, you will see in its properties here, we've got appearance, we've got behavior. Where we want to go into is value. Typically, when you will drag this on, its value would be using the static option. If you click that, it'll swap to a dynamic option, and in the drop-down, you'll be able to select the variable. So what we're doing here is we're saying whatever I'm selecting as a user in this drop-down, we need to make that information available into this variable. So it's getting stored into that variable itself. So if I select in this drop-down the 12 a.m., my variable will now say 12 a.m. If I do that to the 12:20, it'll have the 12:20. So how do we actually see that? How do we know it's doing that? Across the top, we're just going to edit the particular app. So I'm just going to create a new label. We've just cloned the first one. We're just going to give it some spacing on the left. And instead of it having the words of pump data in there, we are going to set it to variable.time. Actually, select the time. That's what we're interested in. So now if we go back to the actual app itself and we refresh this, there's no value currently for that particular field. If I select something in, you'll see I now have a value that has been selected for it. If I go down, it'll select the next one, and if I keep going down, it'll select the next one as well. Because we are dealing with date times, it's going to bring up the raw date time information for me as well. That's why it's very important to make sure you're using the correct data sources and you're not trying to do this as a string when it should be a date time, or a string when it should be an integer or a double or a long. So very important there. So again, if I come back and reload this the first time, you'll notice that nothing will be displayed until I actually select something in the field that I've got coming in. As soon as I select something, it'll make that value available into that field, which is across the top there, and I can now use it on any of the other fields on the form that I want to. So where is this actually being used? So we're just going to get rid of the top, and we're going to come back to the actual date selector itself, and we go into the box. We can just minimize all the items. The two boxes that we've actually got here, if I highlight the one, and how I know they've got data bound to them is they have a yellow border around them as well. So looking at this page, I can see that there is data for them. So that is how I know to look at them for their data sources. So if I just click the one that we're looking at here, you'll see this is bound to its pump history data. However, the visible, we're actually using a quick expression value. So again, if we come back to variables, the first one, we were using it as a value. The second one, we were using the expression editor here, and we're going to add some days when you've selected it, and we're going to convert it, etc. So you're using the expression editor as part of the variable itself. The other way you can use this as well is on any of the fields that allow you to change static to dynamic to quick expression, you can use the expression editor as well. So typically, this field, looking at it here, you would have a true or a false. However, we only want this to display if you have selected something in the top. We could bind it to a variable, and we could have the variable handle that as well. But what we're going to do in this instance, if I click that a second time, it's actually going to give me the quick expression value field. If you click into that field, you'll see exactly the same window pops up. It's exactly the same window that popped up when we were doing this on the variable side. If you click parameters, variables, you can see my two variables. I have all my constants. I have all my functions coming in here as well. So typically, you would have your static value. You would click the one to be able to select something either on the data source that binds around you, or on the actual variables or parameters. Or if you click it again, you get access to the quick expression value. This one here is using a conditional check. If that variable is a valid date, then it's going to use it on this particular data source in here as well. If it is not a valid date, then it is going to set the visibility of this to false. So this here, you'll see there's actually two boxes in this example. All it's doing is it's taking the one, making the one visible, and taking the other one, making the other one invisible for it. These particular boxes here have a data source, and on the filter, here you can see we're actually using that variable as well. When you create any filters or any of the options in here, and you're using the filter control, it'll default to the static value. If you click that, again, it'll turn into a selectable, so it's more of a dynamic option. Here, you can see there's the data source around it, but we're interested in the variable. So we can actually define and select that variable that we're interested in here as well. So variables can be used and have their values assigned by interacting with different fields on the form. And to do that, on the actual control that you want to update the variable, you need to make sure that you set its value to that variable. You can then use this variable in different ways. One of them in a filter, which is what we've got in here. So again, if I go all the way up here and I go to its filter, you'll see a variable gets used in this filter as well. You can use it again in anything that has a static to a dynamic to a quick expression editor in here as well. One more area you can use expressions. If I just discard all those changes coming in here, and we can close the filter, there we go. On the page data side, you'll see I have my pump data, so I have all my data coming through from my particular data source. So if I click the pencil, you'll see this is coming from a data stream. What you can also do here is you can create expressions on this data source as well. So what I want to do here, I'm going to call it indicator color. We're going to keep it as a string, and I'm going to go into functions. We're going to use the if. So here what we're going to say is if, and what you'll see is because I'm in a data source, I have a new section called fields available. If you are not in a data source, you will not get the fields option. But what this allows me to do is interact with these fields coming through here. So what I can do is, let's have a look at the data flowing through here. What we want to do is just put a simple conditional clause in there that if my temperature goes above, let's say 95 for non-drive end. So if my non-drive end temperature, again, click where you want, double click. So if my non-drive temperature is upwards of 95, then what we want to do is we want this to be red, otherwise we want this to be green. We can click save. What we're doing here is we're creating a expression on the data source itself. So right at the bottom, indicator color was not available in the original data source. However, there are conditions, there is logic. I actually want to use the conditional indicator now. So now what I can do is I can have a look at the actual item here, and if I select the box in question, this is bound to the pump data. I'm going to just move this up a little bit so we can actually see what it looks like. And we are going to drag on an indicator. I'll just put it at the top for now. Now on the indicator, you'll see I have the color option here. I can provide a static color. If I click that, I then get access into the data source. Because there's a data source that is sitting around this particular indicator, there is my indicator color. I know it's an expression, because of the FX, I can actually click that, and now I can use that in my app itself. So if I just save that and we just refresh the app, you'll see the color will start changing as the condition is met that I've actually defined for it in as well. So the color indicator, you could work that color out in an actual data stream. There's nothing wrong with doing it there. You can also do it within the app designer on the actual data source itself, like we've done over here. You can get a lot more complex in your expressions using the functions, using the constants, using the fields, etc. Another example of what you could do is if I go into the variables here and I say, I just want to create a variable called full name for the user. Again, it's going to be a string, and we can say expression. If we go into constants, you'll see there is a first name, there is a last name. If I double click first name, it'll fill that in for me. We're just going to add a space in there and double click last name for that as well, and click save. So creating variables is very easy. The one thing to keep in mind is, what are you wanting to use the variable for? And where do you want to update it, and where do you want to use it in a filter, etc. If I go into the top here again, and we're just going to create a bit of a space here. This one here, we're again going to click the static, and in there we are just going to use the full name. And if we refresh to see what that actually looks like, you'll see it'll bring the full name coming through for a variable, which means if I now need to update the data source or pass this down into a system that I'm trying to integrate with or update or insert, I can actually pass who was the user through there as well using a variable. Thank you for your time today and for attending another Lunch and Learn. One thing to remember, we only touched on 2 of the areas of variable use. These are mainly used inside the app designer. There is a third inside the data stream designer, which we'll get to in a future Lunch and Learn. Thank you again for the time.